Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to address you this morning. I'm a slightly different animal, probably, than most of you are used to seeing. But anyway, we'll see how we get on as we go through my talk. I thought I'd tell you a little bit, just very briefly, about the huge changes that have taken place in forensic science over the last 4 decades, during which I've been working, because I've been around for a very long time. And the value of statistical approaches was recognised a long time ago, and the need for sound data to underpin it. We've been aware of that for a long time. The significant challenges we face, and never less than today, but they might be slightly different from the ones you could imagine. And I do it very much from a forensic scientist, an operational forensic scientist perspective, and not a statistician's. Well, I just say that quickly so you're aware. And I'm going to include 2 complex case examples. Part of my career has been involved in investigating complex cases, which I hope will show you some of the interesting issues that we have to deal with, in the hope that you might have some ideas of how to help us solve them. I know there are systems that can help with that, but I just want you to see the complexity of some of it. So just because you won't know who I am, although Norman's given you a quick idea, my background is rooted in the Forensic Science Service many years ago, and then Forensic Access, which was a company I set up because I was very worried about the balance of scientific evidence at court, and the fact that all the cards seemed to be with the prosecution, which didn't seem to be quite right. And if there were weaknesses in scientific evidence, sometimes, as a police scientist in the early days, it wasn't possible to bring them out and to get what we felt was a balance to the evidence, because we simply weren't asked the sort of questions that would allow us to do that. And then in 1997 it looked as if the balance was slipping a bit too much one way, and it was too easy to unpick the forensic science evidence being put forward by the prosecution. So then came Forensic Alliance, which was set up mainly for the police, but we started to specialise in cold cases from about 1998 onwards. And then, because it's very important to have R&D obviously in forensic science, we merged Forensic Alliance with LGC Forensics, which was the laboratory of the government chemist, and that enabled us to have access to much more science from the wider scientific community, so that was a good thing. And then in 2010, when I left LGC, I got locked out of the UK market, and it seemed to be just a little bit too early to retire, so I then went overseas and have been trying to help authorities overseas make sure that their forensic science is up to date and safe. And then in 2013 I managed, when the lockout period had finished, I managed to pull the overseas company together with the pre-existing UK-based one. And now, you might be wondering why I've got Strathclyde logo on all my slides, but it's now because I have a role also at Strathclyde University, where I want to make an academic home for some of the things that we've learnt about complex cases over many years. So changes in forensic science. Well, we've gone from being a pretty much completely public service to a completely private service. We've gone from a heavy emphasis on forensic biology, so sort of physical traces like paint and glass and marks, footwear marks, footwear marks, manufacturing marks, tool marks, and that sort of thing, to biology, and that's largely, or almost entirely actually, because of the advent of DNA profiling, which gave us such an incredibly powerful source of evidence, completely revolutionised the support that body fluids and other things containing DNA could provide to courts and investigators. We've gone from producing our results of our test from weeks and even months. There was a terrible period, which I know some in the audience will remember, when it took absolute months to get a DNA profile out, even in the most serious of cases, murder cases, and that was because it was such a powerful technique, everybody wanted it, and it was extremely difficult to gear up quickly enough to satisfy that. But anyway, so we've gone from weeks and months to hours and days, really quickly do things these days. We've gone from tailor-made cases where you can actually think about what you're doing to completely commoditized services, and that's partly in a drive by the police, who are under huge pressure to cut their cut costs because they're under tight budgetary pressure. And so now they are tending to specify we'll have 2 DNAs and a fingerprint or something like that in a case, rather than allowing us to understand the full case circumstances and help them decide what's necessary. We went through a period when we integrated other specialisms like forensic archaeology and anthropology, entomology, soils, things like that, palynology, pollen grains, into mainstream forensic science, but we're beginning to come out of that now because it's all too expensive. And nowadays we're moving very much from physical traces, except for DNA and fingerprints, to digital data. Mobile phones and computers are huge sources of evidence that we use in our investigations in courts today, the 3 main types of forensic evidence. And we're moving very much from the laboratory up to the crime scene. We're moving up to the sharp end, so now there's an enormous amount of interest in the kind of techniques you can use very quickly and simply and on site. You don't have to, you don't need a laboratory for them. And these are all reflecting crime rates, and then probably advances in technology which change social behaviour, which then drive different crime types and patterns. I'm thinking particularly obviously of the digital revolution and the way that everybody lives on their mobile phones, which is really like a kind of mobile computer these days, and of course the pressure on police budgets that I talked about. So, looking at how data and statistics have changed over the years, or the way that that scientists forensic scientists have used them. In the 1970s, we were very good at collecting data, but we were pretty bad at using it. Nowadays, we're good at collecting some data, and DNA would be a good example of that, although not right across the board, but we're very bad at collecting and continuing to collect others. And that's partly because we're not using it as much, but when, of course, we do use it, we need to be able to interpret it properly. But we're theoretically good at using it, although there are some challenges to that, but sometimes it's misunderstood, and increasingly, interestingly, often these days it's no longer required, and I'll explain what I mean about that as we go through the slides. In the 1970s and 80s, we had lots of different kinds of reference data, and I've just put some examples of things up there. But manufacturers' databases, we used to go and find out what the latest vehicle paints were and all the rest of it. Reference collections, which we collected assiduously ourselves from various different sources. We had, in fact, our labs used to be, the walls of them used to be full of these reference collections. It's a bit Dickensian now, looking at how they looked, but anyway, that's what it used to be like. We sampled our casework that came in and collected data from that. We used chance encounter studies. We call them target studies, but actually I think for you it would be easy to understand chance encounter. So we would look at, for example, park benches and vehicle seats and all sorts of other things and find out whether or not you could find fibres of a particular type on them, how easy it was to find them, and so on. And we used to choose as our target fibres those that were most commonly or found in most commonly available types of clothing, for example. And then we would look at transfer and persistent studies, and we did a lot of that sort of thing, and some examples there. And we began computerizing our data, and we also paid a lot of attention to our ILACs, our interlaboratory advisory committees, that made sure that we were doing things to the right, the data we were collecting was sound. And of course quality assurance started to come in a major way in the, I think it was probably the 1980s, but in the wake of several high-profile miscarriages of justice, Birmingham 6 and John Priest and cases like that. So the use of reference data, and some of this is fairly horrific actually, I think, looking at it now, but we obviously use them in evidential assessments and as a frequency of occurrence, which backed up what our experience of doing casework. And we expressed it on a verbal scale, and I put in today's verbal scale there, so you can see how it ramps up. But in those days, we really only looked for the extent to which the evidence supported the prosecution's case. We didn't consider the defence proposition, or not in any formal sense. We used phrases like consistent with and similar to, which could mean almost anything to anybody really, and are generally frowned upon these days. We initially, if the defence wanted to commission some work, they had to do it via the police, and so the police got the results before the defence lawyers did, and of course that put them off asking for things, and so that obviously wasn't a good way of doing it. So when defence experts were commissioned, what they tended to do was to focus on their own industrial inquiries. So I remember several times during my career, one of the things I used to give evidence on was textile fibres, and I often had the question asked of me, well, do you know that the assertion, do you know that so many miles of carpet containing this particular type of fibre were produced in this country and retailed all around this area? And so it's hardly surprising that a fibre like that has been found in this case. So quite interesting, but that actually I think opened up our minds, quite good for us really as police scientists, open up our minds a bit to relevant things. By 2016 there's been a decline in a marked decline in any databases the FSS, the Forensic Science Service, held, and their collections and studies, and it's all about cost and concerns. And actually originally the decline started to come about, I think, because of concerns about authentication, because some of these collections were not properly authenticated. Fragmentation of new data, because now you've got a private market operating in forensic science. Obviously you've got different organisations collecting their data, and so you get fragmentation between the whole, the whole mass of information. And then what I think, and I imagine lots of other forensic scientists around I know a lot of other forensic scientists around the country think there was the disaster of the closure of the Forensic Science Service in 2012, and with some important exceptions, and DNA is one of them, although it's not universally wonderful. Relatively little data is now collected, and there are very few studies, chance encounter type studies, conducted, and transfer persistence ones. Universities are now probably more involved than they ever have been, but you've got to be very careful that they understand what the real operational requirements of the data will be for them to make a full contribution. So the use of reference data since the 1970s, the miscarriages of justice, as I said, led to quality systems, and then there was the advent of DNA profiling, which is the biggest thing that's happened in forensic science, probably now being matched by the digital revolution. Anyway, these gave rise to a deeper consideration about how we actually reported our results and how we drew conclusions from them, and also a desire and the prospect of being able meaningfully to combine one type of evidence with another type, because obviously if you've got several different bits of evidence and they all point in the same direction, that would be a sensible thing to do, or if they didn't, it would be in any event. And Bayes provided a very suitable framework for this. It gave us more balanced, or the opportunity to provide more balanced evidential assessments, because it forced scientists to think about alternative propositions, which was great. And it gave us more focused testing strategies through the CAI, the Case Assessment and Interpretation Initiative that was set up by the Forensic Science Service, which was extremely helpful. And this was based on questions, asking questions, the answers to which would support one proposition or the other. And there's more a need for more transparency about all of this, which is what CAI and Bayes generally gave, amid concerns, for example, about cognitive bias, which we now know much more about than we did previously. But this approach is now in partial decline, and it sounds really odd to stand here and say that when we've actually got a tool and we've been using it in a certain way. But this is because there's a trend towards streamlined reporting, streamlined everything in forensic science, and with streamlined reporting, streamlined forensic reports, SFRs, you can have at one level, SFR1, you would have the scientific results being provided by a police officer who'd have a kind of look-up DNA table and would give you some statistics, not necessarily related directly to the case, but give you an idea of an order of magnitude of the result. To SFR2s, where a forensic scientist has been involved and might be able to do some comparisons and something slightly more complicated, but still not a full evaluation of what the the evidence might mean, or the findings might mean in a particular case circumstance. And then obviously, if you're not doing streamlined reporting, then you can have a full evaluative report, which is much more expensive and therefore less attractive. But obviously, sometimes that happens, thank goodness, and that's when the scientists can talk not just about the source of DNA, but the activity that might have given rise to it in the context of the case. And then the other thing that means that this whole Bayes approach to testing and assessment means it isn't quite like it used to be, is the fact that the forensic strategies are increasingly set by police, and they will order, for example, using forensic science suppliers, the laboratories, as kind of testing houses. They will order, say, 2 or 3 DNAs and a fingerprint analysis or something like that, rather than asking for some more general support before the testing starts. So I want quickly to talk about 2 complex cases. One of them is Stephen Lawrence, where there was some evidence, and one of them concerns a chap called David Rafferty, when there was, well, I would say no evidence, but there was a tiny bit of evidence. So in relation to Stephen Lawrence, and I've chosen it partly because I think you'll all know this case, it's got a long and very complex history. You'll remember that a gang of white youths was suspected of having been involved at a very early stage. They weren't actually apprehended for 2 weeks, which of course always gives the forensic scientist a little bit more difficulty than if they're arrested within 24 hours, or preferably running away. And there are questions around that are still being asked today. There was a failed private prosecution in 1996, nothing to do with forensic science, but to do with one of the main eyewitnesses, Stephen's friend, who slightly changed his account, I think that was the problem with that. Then there was a Kent police inquiry, and you'll remember the public inquiry by Macpherson, and that awful conclusion that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist, which has lived with them probably ever since. Continuing investigation through forensic science for over the years. In 2004, there was an attempt made to see whether there would be enough circumstantial evidence to prosecute, and in preparation for the day when there might be, the double jeopardy rule was scrapped. So I'm sure you will remember that as background. Well, when we came to do the re-investigation in 2006, we did what we normally do, which is go back to the crime scene and consider what we should be looking at. And we actually started with a scaffolding pole and looking for the transfer of paint fragments from that onto Stephen and Stephen's clothing. And that was because some eyewitness had given an account that showed that he might have been struck with a blunt object, and this was found very close to the scene before he was stabbed. Anyway, while we were doing that, we noticed on Stephen's clothing that there were red fibres all over the outside of it, and we quickly established that these had actually come from a polo shirt that he was wearing underneath, but such is the nature of fibres that they shift about all the time, or the little tiny fibre fragments that break off the ends of the bulk fibres. But we thought it was interesting because these are the sorts of things that we might look for on the suspect's clothing. Then we looked at 2 of the suspects, Gary Dobson and David Norris, to see if we could find any of these red fibres, and to our immense surprise we did, and we found both sorts, polyester and a cotton. Is there a pointer on this? Is that thing there? Yeah. So here, that's a polyester and those are cottons. So that was interesting. And then we thought, well, if we're finding fibres that could have come from Stephen on the suspect's clothing, we'll look for some other ones. And so then we looked, and the more we looked, the more we found. So we found 2 more types of fibre. We found some green cottons from his trousers on David Norris, and we found a blue-green polyester from his jacket on Gary Dobson. And then in our search for fibres, we thought, where else can we have a look? Where else might we find fibres lurking? And we thought, well, what about the packaging in which these things had been stored for so long? And so we had a look in there, and to our great surprise, we found a blood flake, which is up there, which is absolutely tiny. It looks rather big there, but it was a tiny blood flake. But through this blood flake, there were two blue fibres that were running, and they matched Stephen Lawrence's cardigan. So now we had 5 different types of fibres, which is huge evidence. And we had the blood, which we profiled, and obviously that matched Stephen. And then we went back to the jacket, because we thought, well, if the blood's in the packaging of the jacket, there must be some blood on the jacket. And we found a tiny blood spot inside the back of the neck, which is where you might expect it in the stabbing incident, which I can explain later if anybody's interested as to why. And then also, while we were looking at fibres, we found 2 short hair fragments on David Norris's clothing, which could have come from Stephen. So quite a lot of evidence at the end of the day, and there it is, just summarised. So you can see the arrows represent links. You can see there are lots of arrows, particularly in relation to Gary Dobson. He's the one with who had Stephen Lawrence's blood on him. So the first thing we had to do, obviously, was to make sure that this was safe, and that contamination, with all this mixed history of being examined all these countless times over a large number of years, that couldn't have given rise to this evidence. And so we spent a long time looking back and looking for each piece of evidence exactly what had happened to the items involved, and whether or not there couldn't have been any contamination. We satisfied ourselves that that couldn't be the case, but obviously later on we would have to go on and satisfy a court. And then in relation to working out the evidential significance of the blood and the hair, that wasn't too difficult. We had some statistics we can rely on, or some data we could rely on, but textile fibres were quite a different matter. We knew that it was very good evidence, but it was just how to get a bit more transparency and a bit more weight into that opinion. So we look back at the chance encounter studies, all fairly old, but to see how rarely fibres matching even the highest selling garments, how often you might find them by chance on a range of different kinds of clothing and other surfaces. And we also were lucky enough to gain access to the old FSS database that was collected from cases between 1982 and 1989, and that indicated the approximate frequency of the fibre types that we had identified. Generally speaking, there were about 4 different characteristics that were stored on the database. Fibres were analysed and were stored on the database. But the lawyers didn't want us to provide an overall figure because of the nervousness in the wake of that famous case RVT, when the undisclosed use of a footwear database created huge problems in court. And I think they didn't want all the debate to be about, the way we'd used statistics rather than the fact that there was some good evidence there. So they decided not to do that. So the outcome was, as everybody will know, well, first of all, Dobson's acquittal, because he'd been acquitted in the private prosecution. 1996, that had to be quashed first of all, and then they could have a trial, and then they were convicted of Lawrence's murder. And now the police are trying to identify a third man. I'm sure you'll have seen that on the news fairly recently. We're wearing this very distinctive jacket, and now they've got an image of him on some old CCTV footage at the time. But very interestingly, there are some things, while I was thinking about this case, I thought, yeah, there are some things actually that threw the original scientists off the scent. First of all, the screening test for blood that they were using, which is the same one that's in use today, but is so sensitive that it can detect one part in 10,000, in other words, the equivalent of a drop in a bucket of water. So, a negative result using this test must mean there's no blood there. Never mind how we use the test, which actually is critically important, but the fact that no blood was found meant there was no blood there. Transfer and persistent studies, well, they showed an awful lot of fibres transferred, drop off in a very short space of time after the transfer. So there's no point looking for fibres from Lawrence's clothing to the suspects, because they weren't arrested for 2 weeks, and by that time all of the fibres could have dropped off, so what's the point? And that misled the original scientists, and they focused on fibres that had been transferred the other way round from the suspects to Lawrence. And they found a few relatively common fibres, wool fibres I think they were, and they wouldn't have meant much, and so they thought, well, they don't mean much, we haven't really got much evidence here, so there's no point looking any further. The hairs were too short for analysis. They were tiny. I think they were 2 millimetre and 1 millimetre at that time. In the UK we couldn't do mitochondrial DNA analysis on that, so there's no point trying with that. But I think the more I do these kind of cases, that Edmund Locard's assertion in 1910 that every contact leaves a trace is completely right. And really it's whether or not we can find it and what we can make of it when we do find it. So the second case I'm going to go quickly through concerns the murder of a chap in 1993. Basically there was a fight outside. It was David Rafferty was the one who died. A fight outside Mohammed Abbas's flat, and there was some vomit found on the ground outside that was later linked to the body. And then the prosecution case was that Rafferty was dragged inside the flat, left on a balcony overnight, taken to where he was found in a culvert and left there next morning using a friend's car. There were 9 scientists involved, and the only thing they found was this vomit link. It had apparently some chemical similarities to vomit on Rafferty's jacket, and I have to say this was not done by a mainstream forensic scientist. It was done somewhere else, in a university, I think. But there was none of these other things, none of these other signs that we would be looking for. And that's a picture which shows, this was taken at the time, which shows a mirror there. When you looked at it, as I did, it was completely undisturbed. It was broken, and if there'd been a body dragged out there, it would have looked very different, because it was right outside the door onto the balcony. There was no way it would have been left looking like that. And there were no textile links, none of this. I've said no culvert debris, which was really important and demonstrates why it's really necessary always to go to the crime scene. When you're under the culvert sort of bridge, and I'll put a picture up there, you have to stoop. Even I'm not very tall, but I had to stoop like this, and all the time you're banging your shoulders onto the culvert, and all these horrible, sticky, concretey accretions that sort of kind of stick to your clothing, and you can't avoid it, and they're very difficult to get rid of, so you'd have expected some of that. But all these things were not mentioned. The damage to the knees of his jeans, reflecting bruising on his knees. His jacket 100 yards upstream, well, it's not floated up there. The jacket's inside out, which is a common sign of hypothermia, and that all came into the equation. Mud staining on his elbows, that's interesting pattern. Blood low down on the culvert wall here, and this is where the body was found, and his jacket was right up there somewhere. So at the end of it, it looked as though it was probably a ghastly accident. He had drugs and alcohol in his body, and that he had probably just fallen in the culvert and then made his way on all fours down to this particular location, banging his head and creating some of the injuries on his face on the way, and then finally passing out where his body was found. So the outcome was that there was no case. When we had made all the points that we could make on behalf of the defence, there was no case to answer. But what if no second opinion had been sought? I mean, that's the key thing. First of all, did he die in the flat or didn't he? And secondly, did he die because he was killed, or was it an accident? If these questions had been asked and then the findings set against those, I think the whole thing would have been quite obvious from the beginning, and he would never have been taken to court. So, avoiding miscarriages, because I try not to be too gloomy about this, but I'm quite sure the way things are going, we're heading in this direction. I think it's really important for forensic science to be independent, and more of it is being taken into police forces now, particularly the really difficult bit, which is the bit about deciding what you're going to look at and then screening items to see if you can find the evidence before you send off the swatch of fabric or the swab to your forensic science provider laboratory. Coherent, so making sure that the work isn't fragmented in any one case between laboratories, consistent, that all laboratories approach it roughly in the same way, and that adheres to basic principles set out by the Association of Forensic Science Providers, that the evidence should be balanced, it should be logical, it should be robust, and it should be transparent. And one of those big things there is obviously the language that we use, making sure everybody can understand it. So I'm sorry I haven't left any room for questions, unless you can create some room, but I shall certainly be around for a bit.
Thank you. One quick question, if anybody's...
I'll ask a question about the blood on the back of the note.
Yes.
Oh, the blood. Well, when you're stabbing somebody, when you were stabbing somebody, you know, and obviously the more you stab them, the more wet the blood gets with knife. As you raise your arm before you go to the next blow at the end of the trajectory, when there's a shock to the arm and the knife, you can get tiny little droplets of blood that come off, and they can go down the back of clothing, and sometimes even go inside the neck. So and this spot was just inside the neck there. It's interesting.
Final question, yeah.
Right. One of your statements with respect to Bayes provided a suitable framework in that it forced scientists to think of alternative propositions. Well, scientists should be thinking of alternative propositions in any case.
Shouldn't they? Yes.
So it is interesting that it, as you say, took Bayes to force them to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just my...
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more. But it forced them to do that, which was a very good thing, because it was very prosecution biased before. It really was.
Okay.